In my early days, I got to work with a fellow at Deloitte Haskins & Sells at the time, who was an engineer, and he was also Ward 1 alderman. And so a lot of real estate guys like working with him because he knew tax, he knew engineering, and he knew all of the zoning rules in downtown. And he ended up being my mentor.
Welcome to another episode of the Refined Real Estate Podcast. It's Manny here, and I'm with my co-host Janelle and our honored guest today, Andrew Murphy. We are real estate investors in Halifax. Combined, we've done over 40 units, and that's just me and Janelle and Ian. We haven't even gotten to Andrew yet, but we've flipped houses, wholesaled, and much more. And also, Ian and Janelle are mortgage brokers with the Blake Wilson Group. In today's episode, like I said, we have Andrew Murphy with us. We're going to talk about his history, his journey in real estate, and also some hot topics. You guys will see what I'm talking about. But before we get into it, don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, please be kind and give us a 5-star rating. If you want to get in touch with us, we're all active on Instagram. You can find us at the Refined Real Estate Nova Scotia, Refined Real Estate NS on Instagram, or our personal Instagram. First off, before we get into it, what's going on, guys? Anything new?
Nothing too new.
Yeah, nothing new at all.
Nothing new.
Still the same problems.
Same problems. I feel you there. I guess we can get right into it then, to be honest with you.
Yeah, so my name is Andrew Murphy. I grew up in Halifax and have spent my career here. I went to Dalhousie and I took a degree in finance. I got an honors degree in finance and graduated in 1982. Yeah, so I graduated in 1982 from a class with 7 students. So now if you go to Dow and take finance, there's probably 200 or 300. So I was an early finance guy. And then after a couple of years, I got into becoming a chartered accountant. So what I do now is I'm a CPA chartered accountant. I've got a private practice with a bunch of clients. And then I do a fair amount of work on my own real estate deals.
What's the name of your company?
Andrew J. Murphy, CPACA, Inc.
Perfect. Too easy.
Yeah, and in my early days, I got to work with a fellow at Deloitte Haskins & Sells at the time, who was an engineer, and he was also Ward 1 alderman. And so a lot of real estate guys like working with him because he knew tax, he knew engineering, and he knew all of the zoning rules in downtown. And he ended up being my mentor. So early on, I did a fair amount of real estate work in Halifax in the early 80s. Yeah, and then had always got to travel more maybe than the next guy, and would continually wonder why stuff I'd seen in other cities wasn't being done here. So eventually I bought a building down on Gottingen Street when Gottingen Street was really on the roads. So this was 33 years ago, and most of the storefronts were boarded up. Halifax was continuing to depopulate out to the suburbs.
Probably not like the Gottingen Street that we see today with all the new builds.
No, it was not like the Gottingen Street at all of the new days. So I was able to buy a 30,000 square foot furniture warehouse from the original Blueby family. And I sat on it for a while, and then now I'm in the process of converting it to approximately 50 units. So it was on 22,000 square feet of land, and with the center plan, it's been more and more enhanced with increased assessment or development capacity. So the back parking lot went from the ability to build 3 little 1,200 square foot townhouses to being able to do a 9-story apartment building. So things have changed down in Gottingen. And now what else about Gottingen?
Yeah. And I think the story Steve told us to me of how you purchased that building, if you want to just touch on that and how you got the financing for it, because the financing for it is a lot different than it might look today, I would say.
Yeah, so I had the luck to go to school with the grandson of the founder of the Blueby's furniture store chain. So Blueby's, years ago, there were 7 stores across Nova Scotia, and it was the biggest furniture outlet east of Quebec City. And the family had sold that business a number of years before, but not the property on Gottingen Street, because literally nobody wanted it. Even though it's about a 10-minute walk from City Hall at the most, it was quite a depressed area at one time. And so the family gave me a 100% mortgage on it. I didn't have to put a nickel down, and eventually I was able to buy it.
And at the time, would you have, and still now, would you have referred to that as a vendor take-back, or? Yeah,
it was. Originally, we had a quite elaborate lease to purchase deal with options to buy at different times for different amounts of money. And then finally, after a few years, it still hadn't improved. They just said, well, it's time to buy it, Andrew. And I did.
Mm-hmm. So when you purchased it, did you have any tenants in there at all, or was it empty? Like, what was the state of it? It was
empty. So there was 15,000 square feet of empty retail space.
Wow.
And there were there was about 10,000 square feet of storage lockers. Mm-hmm. And over the years, we put a lot of things into that building. At one point, we had 10,000 square feet of band practice space. We had artist studios. We did those things you do with a big old building in the middle of the city. That certainly we knew there was no tenant to take a big 10,000 square foot chunk of it. There was a used furniture store there for a while. And then humorously, for the first year, I had my accounting office in a 10,000 square foot room. So my clients had to walk all the way across to where my desk was. And I claimed that I had the biggest single sized accounting office for a sole practitioner in Canada, which I probably did.
Okay, I didn't realize that because I guess in my mind I'd envisioned you purchasing it and then renovating it and turning it into what is now residential units, but I didn't realize that that's how you're covering the mortgage payments back then.
So I'm actually a pretty cautious real estate investor. So real estate, unfortunately, is sometimes not so good for the first person. So it's a bit like the First World War, where the first guy out of the trench is not what you want to be. And so I actually waited in my neighborhood until theater lofts started and spice lofts and a few other developments. The other thing that was interesting years ago was Gottingen Street was in what was called a red circled area. So because it was so run down, the banks would not loan in that area. And so I'm the guy that did the 6 brightly colored townhouses on Cornwallis Street across from Vandal Donuts. And we had to finance those 2 at a time. And because they were in a red circled area, and I had a really, really good relationship with a guy from the Royal Bank at the time. And I remember phoning him up and I said to him, Luke, I got one more great client for you. And he said, who? I said, me. And I could hear him gulp. And he said, well, how much do you need? And I said, well, $2.5 million to build the whole thing. He said, can you break it down? And so I broke it down to 2 at once. And it just came under his limit that he could approve. And it didn't have to go to Toronto, because it had gone to Toronto. There would be no way they would lend there because it was that inner city neighborhood.
I think that's something that's really important. I think for a lot of people who are just getting into real estate now, like their concept of like what a red zone is probably just doesn't even exist.
I don't think that exists anymore, and for good reason. Some of that was racist, and it was across the country in different areas, and it was really, really dumb. Yeah, it kept areas from being developed, and just kept on a bad thing.
Somewhat of a tribute to like how times change, I would say.
Yeah, and and I know exactly when it changed. So we did 3 deals in a row, and on the third one, I got a call from a guy from Toronto at the credit thing, and he goes, "Okay, yeah, okay, you're Andrew Murphy, okay, you're the guy with the deal we're doing on Yonge Street, no, Yonge Avenue, no, it's Cornwallis." And I knew there wasn't a red circle because he didn't know the difference between Yonge Street and Yonge Avenue. And he had never been to Halifax. Mm-hmm. And the deal went through, sailed through.
Perfect.
Like it should have. So, so what we did was we've done it in phases. And so we're now on our 3rd phase that we're doing. And there's a 4th phase in the parking lot because that got, like I said, zoned from 6 units to a 9-story building.
And then just to understand the timeline of it, so you purchased it around 1990, and then you had it leased out to different, I suppose you want to call them commercial tenants, or yourself for office space, or
it was always little tenants. So at one time Halifax was known as the Seattle of the East, and it had all these bands like Sloan and all the ones that were from here, and they were all practicing down in my basement. So it was kind of fun.
And then at some point in time, you started renovating it and turning it into residential units, as well as developing the townhouses on Cornwallis Street.
Yeah, we did the townhouses first.
Okay, did the townhouses first, and then developed your building into 19 units, is it?
Yeah, okay. It would be 21, say. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're beautiful. Right, really nice.
Yeah, and so what we did was called adaptive reuse. So adaptive reuse is when you take an old building and you make it into something else that it wasn't intended to from the start. And so I've been to lots of places in the world, and in lots of places other than Halifax, they'll take an old warehouse or an old factory building and make it into lofts. Mm-hmm. And then and there are two kinds of lofts. There are what are known as hard lofts, which are original industrial buildings, and then there are soft lofts. And the soft lofts, my neighbor on Gottingen Street, Theater Lofts, is a soft loft. It's a loft, but everything's new. Mm-hmm. And in my building, there are elements that we intentionally left exposed. So if you go in the courtyard in my thing, there's an old gnarly masonry wall that's exposed, and we would never cover that up because that's a big feature saying this is an old building.
Yeah.
And we've got great big Douglas fir beams inside of it, and we've incorporated those into the design.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And then I know you wanted to talk about a little bit of your background. Is there any other parts of your background?
So there was one story I remember that was funny. I thought was I was renting in the early days to somebody who was from Toronto, and it was a student, and there's lots of students from Toronto here, and he was phoning his dad, and he was saying to his dad, I've been looking for an apartment all week, and this is the first one I like. It's just like out of Dwell magazine, and there's nothing else like it here. So in Halifax, we have got lots of boring apartments. Mm-hmm. They're architecturally from the outside not well done, and inside they're cookie cutter. And so it's been fun to be creative with these units.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I guess if you don't mind transitioning,
sure.
I'd love to hear your take on rent control. Now, you've already given us a presentation, so I already know your take.
Yeah. Okay. So rent control is an unfortunate thing. So and I believe you guys have the slide so we can show the difference between new apartment formation in Toronto and in Halifax. But rent control suppresses the construction of new buildings, and so what it does is it very quickly slows down the rate of new construction. So it makes the problem worse. And there's a joke I like to tell. So there was some construction workers outside of my building, one of my buildings down the south end, and they were smoking and having their morning coffee under the trees next to my building, and they would leave the trash there. So I went out and made friends with them, and they respected the property and started cleaning up after themselves. And one day I walked out and I said to them, "Listen, guys, I would like this weekend for you to work for me. And instead of working 8 hours, I want you to work 12 hours. And instead of getting paid what you normally get paid, I want to pay you exactly half what the guy is paying you in the building across the street." And they kind of laughed nervously, and they said, "Well, why would we ever do that?" And I said, "Look, I'm just joking. I'm just trying to explain to you how rent control works. So when you have a shortage of something, reducing the price to the provider of it is not a good idea." So the other problem with rent control is the intended target gets outcompeted. So what we're trying to do is help people in our community that don't have money to afford a really expensive new apartment. But what happens with rent control is the landlord tends to rent to the most creditworthy person. So it's misdirected. You have a shortage of apartments, and the richest people get them. And I remember years ago, my family had an apartment building, a 4-unit building on Inglis Street that I looked after for a while. And it was, 2 doors up from the Resolute Club there on Inglis. And I would put a single ad in the Herald. They hadn't invented the internet yet. And I would wake up at around 10:30 on Saturday morning, having gone out the night before. And between waking up and going to brunch with my friends, I would take about 40 calls. And then maybe 30 people would be in a lineup. And I remember one time distinctively walking through. So I was an articling student in downtown Halifax at a CA firm, and I saw a guy I recognized. And I said, "I've seen you around." And he said, "Yeah, I'm a second year lawyer at Stewart McKelvey." And I said, "Do you want this apartment? It's yours," because I knew I would get paid. Mm-hmm. So rent controls, we can do better than rent controls. What we've really got to do is we got to build an awful lot more apartments, and we need an effective system to allocate those apartments that are subsidized to the right person.
Yeah.
And so there have been oversupplies of real estate in Halifax lots of times before. So a good example is the office supply downtown. So we would go from not having enough office, and then the market would come in and pile in an excess, and that drove the price down. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we need now. We need to build a lot more apartments, and reducing the price for them is going to help in the short run, perhaps, but in the long run, it'll make it way worse.
And how does rent control affect the development of new properties?
It suppresses the price for them. So, and it also makes it not as attractive a long-term investment. So the trick of restricting increases in rent to 2% in a world where inflation became 8% and the cost of power and the cost of fuel oil went up, and insurance,
water, everything.
Yeah. So what you want to worry about is that the investors in your community say, well, why would I bother building an apartment building and having to deal with tenants and so on and so forth? Yeah. Why don't I just buy Royal Bank stock? Yeah. I'll make more money and it's less hassle. And so that's what the problem is the housing sector is competing for capital with every other sector in Canada. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tough situation that we have here. And then throw on everything else, all the other difficulties or like challenges that are associated with being a realtor in Nova Scotia. And it's not incentivizing for larger developers, because those are the people who are making the biggest splash with things. Like, those are the ones who are truly moving the needle. Of course, like, we have smaller investors who are maybe adding a unit here or there, duplex or triplex or whatever it might be. But the people who are building, the 100+ units, like, disincentivizing those groups of people it's very difficult.
It's not a good idea. And nowhere can you really expect. So we've got this affordable housing crisis now. It's the worst that Halifax has seen since the Second World War. And so so now we have people living in tents, and that's not what's supposed to happen. What you're supposed to do in a socialized democracy like Canada is you're supposed to tax rich people to provide for poor people. So what's happening now is they're not taxing people, and they're not building enough houses. So there were times, like after the war and after the Halifax explosion, they built a whole bunch of houses, and they concentrated on it, and it was a government effort. And we probably need that again. Mm-hmm. Expecting landlords to create affordable housing is probably unrealistic. So, and then we've seen this shuffling of responsibility. So the province is supposed to provide it, but the richest area in Halifax is Halifax in Eastern Canada, and the city contribution to affordable housing has been almost nil. Maybe they've voted $3 or $4 million of support for affordable housing, which is about $12 a household.
Yeah.
And this is in a city where a year and a half ago, in the run up of real estate prices, probably everybody was up $90,000 in value on average. And that $90,000 will never be taxed by the feds or the province, because it's mostly people's personal residences. And because of our capped assessment system, the city won't get any more property tax out of those houses. So we've got this paradox where people are getting richer and richer with their houses, and there's no mechanism to share that wealth with the people in tents.
So you think, I agree with you, the government needs to have a responsibility here.
Yeah.
To build houses or apartments,
that's right,
at scale. But do you think they have the capacity? Do you think they're capable of doing it?
Yeah, I think they're capable of doing it. So how you would do it? And I'm going to use an example of a building from my neighborhood, which not everybody's going to know. So on Cornwall Street, across from probably the best ice cream store in Eastern Canada, which is Dee-Dee's, is a 1960s built apartment building called Gordon B. Eisner Manor.
My grandmother lives there.
Oh, okay. Oh, you're not going to like what I'm going to say.
I know, you told me.
Yeah. So what I'd like to see happen is the government should do a 100-year land lease on the surface level parking behind that. So where those cars are parked has been rezoned to be a 9-story apartment building. and the government owns the land. So if you look at the latest waterfront development deals, the nice building called the Canard that Jim Spatz is building. Jim Spatz is a well-established, high-quality Nova Scotia developer. So he was not able to buy that land. He has to lease it from the government.
Mm-hmm.
So if the government would put a tender out for the Gordon B. Eisner lot and say to the tender person, look, we're going to put some money on this thing, but we're going to take 20% of the units for affordable units, and the lease payment, rather than that go to reduce my taxes or reduce my property taxes, if that is dedicated to continuing to maintain affordable housing units, then that would be a solution.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then to add in, if the province supported this, and it's their responsibility to do housing, they can borrow at an incredibly low rate. Before interest rates went up, they could get 15-year money at 1.2%, which was 0.8% below inflation. So if we got it organized with developers that are good at building, we could start to counter this problem. But we need to tax people who are here, and we need to get going with a real plan.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who are listening probably like taxes more. I don't know, but I guess taxing in an efficient way, or utilizing that money in an efficient way.
Yeah, well, we could do a whole session on tax reform.
Yeah,
Tax reform.
we won't get into that right now.
Yeah.
I did want to touch super briefly on something that you mentioned to us during the presentations that you've done. You were explaining like why there's so many cranes in Halifax and why there's so much development going on at one point in time. Anyway, and we're highlighting the fact of immigration into Nova Scotia and how that has affected everything.
Yeah. So what I want to talk about a little bit is overall patterns of settlement, how that affects things in the long run. And you two are both really young compared to myself, but you're starting to invest in real estate around when I did in my life stage. And so if you look at overall patterns, and if you look at a map of Halifax, the year I was born, it's amazing how concentrated it was. Everybody lived on the peninsula, so there's no Clayton Park, there's no Burnside, there's no Bedford, there's no Sackville, there is no sprawl. So Halifax at that point was maybe 130,000 people. 110,000 of them lived on the peninsula. And the peninsula actually depopulated from that down into around 70,000. So people moved outwards into suburbs. And they did that all over North America. And so what I was able to do was go in and buy my two buildings I have when the core of the city was somewhat depressed. And it was a good buy then. So now what's happening is we're starting to urbanize. So people want to live downtown. There's a lot of young people that don't have children and like to be able to go to a cafe and see their friends. Young people now are not so reliant on automobiles. Like, do you have an automobile?
I do, yeah.
You do?
Yeah, we were just talking about this earlier. Yeah. But Manny, before we started recording, Manny was saying how you did not get your license until you were 20.
So I was 20 because I didn't need it.
Yeah, you didn't do it.
Buses everywhere.
Buses everywhere, yeah. So, so people often ask me, where should I buy real estate? And right now, I don't know exactly where because, but I remember after real estate got expensive in Halifax's North End, there were still great deals in downtown Dartmouth and in Dartmouth itself. I remember going to Hamilton, which is a good example of a town that became depressed up in Ontario. And I was downtown and it rained, and there was this great big 6 or 7 story department store downtown, and the water flowed out of the doors because the roof was leaking so bad. And I went back there 10 or 12 years later, and it was gleamingly renovated. Mm-hmm. And I remember, and so what I do when I go to conferences in places like Winnipeg or Hamilton, or I was at a conference this weekend in Ottawa, is I ask people, what is the worst neighborhood within a 20-minute drive of this place? In Ottawa, it's across the river in Gatineau, which is Hull. And in Gatineau, you can see abandoned buildings, and it's so close to Ottawa, which is very prosperous, it has to spread there sometime. So there's some gimmies like that. And what you got to do is you got to have the staying power. If it takes an extra 10 years, then you got to be able to hang in there. And so you don't want to be hanging out on the edge financing wise. But those are areas that'll pick up presumably.
Have the guts to deal with neighborhoods like that. It's easy to say like go buy there. But yeah, have the guts to be able to deal with it as well, because it comes with its own unique set of problems.
It does, yeah. So if you go to any city, you drive in, and when you can see artists, the artists are the stormtroopers of gentrification, is the way the expression goes. And so they go to an area because it's cheap, and they want their studios and things. Exact same thing happened in my area. In fact, I had artist studios and band studios, and so they come and they start hanging out in the local cafes. They make it cool.
I was just gonna say they make it cool,
and then other people come. Yeah, and so in Halifax, we would have to get the city to be proactive. But if the city rezoned Spryfield to allow 5 to 7 story apartment buildings in some of those residential neighborhoods, it could transform into a really cool place.
Yeah.
Because it's pretty much a complete community now. There's grocery stores, there's starting to be restaurants and places to eat. And
what's the height limit now? Because I've seen quite a few buildings.
35 feet.
35 feet. That's
mostly.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's mostly anti-apartment.
Wow.
Yeah. And
they're still developing. They're still building those.
They're starting to build them. Yeah. But there's a new one going. There's 2 new ones that are wooden that have been built in the last 6 or 8 months. Yep. They're not completed, but they're only 4 stories.
Wow.
What a travesty.
Yeah.
It's right on a bus line. Should be. Yeah. And so, and then occasionally people will say, well, what kind of a city do you like? And the center plan was an interesting period for us because we debated what kind of city we want. And the debate is between a mid-height city, which would be a city like Copenhagen or Paris, and a tall city like Vancouver. Mm-hmm. And I like the mid-height city. People, if you live in a 30-story building, you are not going to know your neighbor. If you live in a 5 or 6-story building, you'll often make relationships within your building. You are not going to walk up to your 27th floor apartment. But in a 4 or 5 story, you can work that into your fitness regime and take the stairs. Halifax, I love Halifax as much or more than anybody else, but it's a miserable place to be for about 4 or 5 months a year. It's cold, it's wet, it's rainy, it's snowy. So why would you want more wind and more shade, which comes with tall buildings? We could build this place out to a mid-range thing. The other thing that's interesting about really tall buildings and smaller buildings is who owns them. So we're talking about making as many as 7 30-story towers at Mumford Road in one of those shopping malls, and that development will not be owned by anybody from here. It's too big.
Yep.
So
money.
Yeah. So once that's built for 100 years, all of the rent for all of those apartments will go out of our community. And it's, it may be a dumb way to do it. So a mid-height building tends to be a building built by local developers.
Yeah, you want it to be a little bit more self-sustained, I suppose, in a way.
Yeah, you want to generate your own economic activity in your own community.
So the bigger families that are local, that's too big of a project?
No, yeah, but the thing that's interesting about those bigger families, if you go back, they didn't start with big buildings like that. No, they started with small buildings, and they made a bit of money, and they're from here. So they're developing here and continuing to develop and enhance our community. So I don't know who owns that shopping center, but I think it's the Ontario Pension Fund, Teachers Union. So all of that money, all of the good. And real estate, is real estate a good investment? In 100 years, will those be worth more? Oh my God, yeah.
Yes, undoubtedly.
Undoubtedly. So why, and the city of Halifax, so the other thing to talk about is how do you value sites that sell where you're going to wreck down the original building and build something new? Well, you sell it based on the developable foot. And now we've got lots of properties that have been sold and are going to be demolished or have been demolished. And one of the highest ones that I know of is the Ralston building on Hall Street, which was a great big building that the tax department used to be there years ago. And it was just sold maybe a year or so ago, and it set the bar at $95 per developable foot. So So by the time they rezone those properties for the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, they're going to give them hundreds of millions of dollars of development capacity, and they won't have required them to do anything like affordable housing or anything. So they could sharpen their pencils a little bit, I think. Yeah. So
Did you have any?
so that covers off the overall patterns nicely, and where to look around. Do we want to talk about the Airbnb stuff?
Yeah, let's touch on it.
Let's do it, yeah.
We did one quick episode on it, but we'd love to hear your opinion.
Yeah, because you may put that in a future one. So we've had a big debate on Airbnb, and which culminated 4 or 5 weeks ago in the banning of Airbnb in residential neighborhoods. And on the surface, Airbnb looks like it's bad. It looks like you take units out of the rental pool, and you rent them to tourists instead of people who live here. The problem is that it kind of ignores the one single defining factor of Halifax, and why Halifax Peninsula particularly is different from any other real estate market in Canada. And the reason is the concentration of students. In Halifax, there might be 110 or 120,000 people on the peninsula. At least 20,000 of them are students. So, yeah, sure, the University of Toronto has more students than Dalhousie, but they don't live in as concentrated an area. So what we have, and it's different from when I went to Dalhousie. So now there's a higher percentage of people coming from outside of Nova Scotia going to Dalhousie and St. Mary's and the other colleges. So two-thirds of the people that go to Dalhousie aren't from here, and two-thirds of them don't want to be here in the summer. A great compromise for Airbnb rules would have been to allow people to rent to students in the winter and tourists in the summer. So instead, what will happen is you're not going to be allowed to do that in residential neighborhoods. So it's going to make it more expensive for students. They're going to have to rent apartments all year long rather than just for 8 months.
I know that was when I went to Dal back in 2012, 2013. It was always an issue. Issue of finding a place and renting it for the year. And it's like, what do I do with it for the summer? I'm not going to be here. I'm planning on going home to work anyway. And then I just always remember like posting, like looking for a sublet, looking to sublet.
Yeah.
But if there was the option to do an 8-month rental, and I definitely think I can speak for my mom here. If she could have saved moving 6 kids to Halifax from Sydney and carrying beds and furniture, she definitely would have opted for a furnished apartment. I can definitely assure you that's the case. But if that was more of a service being offered, I think a lot of people would have taken it, would have loved to have that option. Yeah,
and I joke around that if there's one thing that we learned in Halifax during the pandemic is that we can close all the universities. We did for a year and a half. So if we made that permanent, and all those professors sold their houses and moved to Waterloo or Kingston, that would be one thing. If we banned tourism completely, which sounds crazy, because it is, then that would also do a big hit to our economy. And what's happening now at the hearing on Airbnb, they had a guy from Destination Halifax, Ross Jefferson, and he estimated there would be a hit to the tourism industry in Halifax of between $30 and $70 million a year, and there's really no consideration of that. They never considered allowing seasonal Airbnbs to correspond with our demand for students.
Yeah, they never really considered that like some sort of like hybrid option.
Yeah.
And even in the restrictions on Airbnbs that they brought in, how do you think that's going to affect like the affordable housing supply?
So I think it's not going to affect affordable housing supply. What it's going to do is it's going to reduce the income of the landlords that were doing it seasonally. And a lot of landlords I know are crazy. They make some money in real estate and they put it all back in for more. So if you reduce the amount that those guys make, in the absence of any effective government programs to stimulate building, it's going to be negative. And so if we look at the North End, there's a whole bunch of really good restaurants, cafes, coffee shops in the North End. And they were attracting tourists, and particularly in the summer. So one of the things I know, we have a large seasonal Airbnb business in my operation. We do about 12 of them in the summer. We go down to 2. Next winter, we're going to go down to 1 Airbnb. So it's a myth that there is a winter Airbnb market. There is no winter market. So you're far better off renting to students in the winter, and you miss 1 good month of Airbnb, and you don't have to suffer through 5 or 6 months of terrible Airbnb occupancy. Yeah. So
I think just to clarify too, you're doing Airbnb. One of the reasons that the reason that you can still do it even after the changes, because you're commercially zoned.
Yeah, okay. I'm glad you brought that up. So it's I have 2 buildings. I've got another one across from the Port of Wines on Clyde and Birmingham Street. So it is also commercially zoned. It is not zoned commercially and for a hotel. So I can't do it in Birmingham Street, but I can do it on Gottingen Street, which is zoned. So there are very few places in Halifax that you can do Airbnb.
And it's because it's CM1 and the other one is CM2, correct?
Yeah, it's Center 1 and Center 2. And it has to be Center 2 or on a corridor. So there's a whole bunch, probably more than half of the commercially zoned properties in the city.
Still illegal.
It's illegal. Wow. Yeah, and when they were selling it to people didn't know that.
Okay. And then what about, I know we briefly touched on this a couple weeks ago, but what about duplexes or basement suites? Because I see a lot of that question on like Facebook groups, people asking, hey, so I have a duplex or I have an ensuite in my basement, I can still Airbnb that. So what
are the
regulations on that?
So the regulations are, if it's your personal residence, you can. And it was interesting, during the Tuesday night debate that went to around 11, Councillor Cuddle brought it up. She said, it looks like if you have a basement apartment in your house, you cannot Airbnb that, which is true. But your tenant can.
And wait, why is that? Why?
Because it's not your personal residence. It's a separate residence, which is not your personal residence.
Okay.
So it's very picky.
There's a lot of people out there who are under the impression that they're seeing that basement suite as in their personal residence. But what if it has the same address? Like, what if it's
a separate suite? So they passed earlier in the fall the registration of apartments rule, which is another tragic piece of legislation that they passed in the city. So there are all sorts of illegal apartments in Halifax, and they've changed the zoning so that quite often they can be made legal again, but they have to be brought up to code. And code is different from when those buildings were built. One of the things you have to do if you've got a basement apartment that's not legal now is you got to install 36-inch doors in all the doors. And there's very few of those. You have to put fire code gyprock between floors. If that makes it below the National Building Code height limitation, you have to dig the basement down. So a lot of the cheap apartments we have now, the $500, $700, $800 ones, they're going to need to do $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 worth of work to them to make them legal. And now there's 2 guys that have been hired, 2 personnel to the city to police that, to force people to do that.
And how are they doing that? Do they have a list of like the registration of the apartments?
So this is every so often Halifax City Hall does what I call a Santa Claus move. So Santa Claus, of course, is the guy who on Christmas Eve delivers all of the presents all around the world by going down people's chimneys in about a 4 or 5 hour period. And furthermore, he knows who's been naughty and nice.
Okay. And
so the city have hired 2 guys to do that. And in addition to doing all that work, discovering you're supposed to register your apartments, which will create a lot of these ones that are not currently legal. And the problem with it is 2 guys couldn't register 80 apartments. The other thing they have to do is they have to receive maintenance plans on all of those apartments that are sufficient enough to never have another building in Halifax need to be renovated to cause rent evictions. So you would need 40, 50 people to do that, and we've got 2.
Wow.
So it won't work.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay. And just to jump back to the question, just to make sure I understood. So if you have a house, and there's an ensuite in the basement, and it has its own entrance, but I suppose would be considered one address. Can you Airbnb that ensuite?
No. And the reason is if it has its own kitchen and its own entrance and if it's self-enclosed, it's a separate dwelling and it could not be your personal residence.
So it has to be like your living area. You can
That's right.
Airbnb your own living area.
Your own living area. Yeah.
Crazy.
Wow.
Yeah. So what that means is there are some people who are lucky enough to have a nice cottage that they go to in the summer. So you could Airbnb your house where you live normally.
Yeah.
And
but you can't Airbnb your cottage if it's an HRM.
You can because in most areas of HRM they allow the renting of cottages sort of under the bed and breakfast rules.
Okay.
And so that's built in it. So it's not something that affects suburbanites. It affects
and if people are wanting more information, do you happen to know where they can read the specific regulation on that basement suite situation? Just because I know a lot of people are asking about this.
Yeah, I think it's hidden. It's hidden in the documents that were published online.
Okay.
Yeah, and then if they've got the patience, it was discussed a number of times, 2 or 3 times during that long debate that night that they passed it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are going to be pretty upset to hear this. I think a lot of people are operating under the impression that it's a second unit within their house.
Yeah.
That they're like, no, like I'm fine, but.
Yeah, no, it has to be your primary residence, and that isn't. And that sort of mirrors federal taxation rules, where if you have a basement suite in your house, then that portion of your house when you sell it is not exempt from the capital gain. You have to, so that. But that being said, it'll be interesting to see how effective they are in enforcing the Airbnb rules. The very definition they have for short-term rentals seems to reflect that it's permanently done or done all the time. So it doesn't specifically ban seasonal Airbnb use. Mm-hmm. I think it'll be tough to regulate. The loophole I see is if you can allow the person who has the lease on your basement apartment to Airbnb, and they allow you to manage that, that'll be really hard for the police.
Mm-hmm. Could you lease it to yourself?
I don't think you can lease it to yourself, but everybody's got a brother or a cousin.
Yeah. Okay.
Can you lease it to a company?
That's kind of what I meant.
But I guess the company has to live there.
The company couldn't live there. So it's it's meant to.
I'm trying to come up with solutions for everybody.
Yeah, and then so whatever they do come up with, we have to follow it. So if they take exception to your use of that, then you can always litigate it, and there's a definition of short-term rentals that we could get up pretty quickly that has a real fundamental flaw. I think it says that primarily used for or mostly used for Airbnb or short-term rental.
And if you're renting out 8 months of the year to a long-term tenant, that's 3/4.
So the very definition they have is problematic, and it would be subject to litigation. Yeah,
I think people will fight it. It's not going to be a smooth transition. But
I don't think it'd be a smooth transition.
I know there's tons of people out there with like 30, 40 rentals. Like that's their bread. Like that's their
business.
Business. Like that's their bread and butter. Like that's how they're putting.
So the scary thing is we don't have a great tourism department in Nova Scotia. It got worse when they moved them all out to Windsor. But I looked and to see what was the average contribution from a tourist who comes here in the summer.
Man.
And I found a statistic on their website finally that said 16% is what the typical tourist spends on accommodations when they come to Halifax in high season. So if you have an Airbnb that brings in $5,000 a month, which would be a common summer gross, then that supports a tourism spend by tourists of around $30,000 a month. Mm-hmm. So every Airbnb, particularly the seasonal ones that are going to be empty anyway, is going to do a big hit to the Halifax economy, and they didn't consider that at all.
They're not. That tourist isn't coming. they're not staying somewhere, so they're not coming to spend money on food, spending money on events, entertainment, travel, taking tours, doing like fishing tours, like going to Becky's Cove.
And if you, so around the time of the hearings, I looked up what it cost to rent what is really probably a 2.5-star room at the Atlantic Hotel. It's kind of a small room, and in August you can rent them for $480 a night. Mm-hmm. So a typical Airbnb price for a nice little apartment, would be closer to $200 a night. Yeah. So what we're seeing is this increase in costs for tourists to come here, and a lot of them will just not come.
And similar to the idea earlier when we talked about how the Mumford redevelopment, a lot of the proceeds from that are going to go to people outside of the province.
Yeah.
A lot of people that own these hotels, they aren't local companies.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
So I think 75% of the hotels in Halifax are controlled by Starwood. Starwood is an American company that's controlled out of a city in Connecticut. And 6 or 7 years ago, those guys almost sold all of Starwood to a Chinese company. So we just shut down hundreds of little entrepreneurs.
Yep.
Local
entrepreneurs. And if they succeed in Connecticut, they're going to sell all that good
to China. Going to China. Yeah. And then we were discussing this prior. What else is the Atlantica Hotel doing?
Atlantica Hotel is got a bunch of floors with refugees in it living there, which trying to get them integrated into our society.
Yeah. Which is fantastic.
That's good.
Yeah.
But how much is the government? How much is the government paying for that?
As much as $10,000 a month for housing those.
Just for one family living in one unit?
They spread them up to a couple units.
Okay.
Yeah, they can't fit all in one.
Wait, so $10,000 for the floor, $10,000 a month for
$10,000 for each family.
For each family to live in one hotel room?
No, in a couple of hotels.
Okay, so across 2 or 3. Okay.
Yeah. So so what we have now is we have a terrible problem with shortage of housing.
Yeah.
It's a crisis, and it's a good thing because we need immigrants to come. We all, when you go through a fast food joint now, and it's somebody not from here.
I have a property in Antigonish, and I was having an extremely hard time finding someone to come do some maintenance on the property. Went through like 2 people, and it was a pretty basic job. Like, so it was just like fixing a toilet. And for example, like I messaged someone, it's like, hey, like I think the toilet needs to be replaced. How much is it? One guy was like, oh, someone charges me, typical company charges $1,000, I'll charge you $500. I was like, I think that's a lot.
Yeah.
Got a quote from another guy. He's like, yeah, I'll do it for $80, but you have to bring the toilet and take it away. I was like, well, it's not very useful for me. And then I saw a post on Facebook from, I think it was a Ukraine family saying like, hey, like we're new to town. We are happy to work. We're looking for more clients. We can do any job around the house, this and that. Message them, and they're like, yep, we got it. We'll take care of it. We'll show up tonight at 8 p.m. And they got it done on a Sunday at 8 p.m. And they're like, here's the bill. And it was a very, like, a modest bill. And I was like, this is great. Like, we need people to do, like, we need more of this.
That's right. Yeah.
It's so difficult to find.
Yeah, and it's great. It's great to see Halifax as a new spirit, things are happening here. Lots of building going on.
But we need housing for them.
We need housing for them. Yeah, we need housing for them. Yeah. So 20,000 people a year coming and 3,000 apartments being built is not enough.
Is that what it is now? 20,000 a year? Because I know it was 10,000.
No, it's up to 20.
It's up to 20,000.
That's what I've heard. Yeah.
And that's why people are upset about the housing situation here. And it's like, well, if you put 10 to now 20,000 people a year into Halifax or Nova Scotia.
Into Nova Scotia, but primarily Halifax.
Primarily Halifax.
Yeah.
And our population was around like just under 500,000.
Yeah.
So that's whatever.
Yeah, and then to get back to the homelessness problem. So 3 or 4 weeks ago, the mayor, who I like, who's a good guy, got up in council and said we have to approve more camping spots in our parks for the homeless. And I thought, oh my goodness. So is the solution is all we can come up with is you can go to Canadian Tire with your $70 and buy a little pup tent and go to a park, and maybe if you've got enough money, put a tarp over it so you don't get wet when it rains. And
that'll fix the housing crisis.
Yeah.
So
when there was an earthquake in Haiti a number of years ago, one of my friends covered it. He was a journalist, and so we sent 2 frigates from Halifax, and they had a bunch of army tents. And the guys with submachine guns, latrine kits, and they set up 10 villages, and they made sure they were safe. And so if from Halifax we can go all the way to Haiti and do this, why can't we do it here?
Yeah.
Why can't we do a better job?
And the other thing here is that, like, personal opinion, and also, like, from research, is that in terms of homelessness, like, a lot of it, like, it's mostly mental health. Like, for example, I was walking down Quinpool the other day, walked by a person who appeared to be homeless. They were sitting on the ground. They had, like, a cup out for change, and they had a blanket around them, and they had someone clearly given them food from one of the restaurants, but the food was there, uneaten, which is, like, maybe they're saving, I don't know, but they're smoking weed. Like, it's just, like, it's crazy because you can literally see the choice between, like, sustenance and an addiction.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's...
Yeah, and then how you treat your most vulnerable people in your society is important. So there's a guy who does a lot of podcasts that I really like. His name is Malcolm Gladwell, and he did a podcast on a fellow in Colorado somewhere, maybe Boulder, and maybe his name was Good Time Charlie or something. And he was a street guy who was really, really well liked.
Oh, I think I know this story.
Yeah. And so he goes to this high-end town, and he goes. Well, I guess the start of the story was he eventually passed away, and there were two ambulance drivers who, ambulance attendants, ambulance operators, who asked the hospital, how much did we spend on Good Time Charlie for the last year of his life? Because he was constantly getting pneumonia, and he was getting sick, and it was $1.6 million.
Yeah.
And so Malcolm Gladwell went to the most expensive hotel in the town and said, if I want your best suite, what is it? And they said, oh, it's this one. It's got a kitchen. It's got 2 separate bedrooms and a hot tub and this and that. And I said, and 2 meals a day. How much is it going to cost me a year? And they said, well, that'd be around $350,000. So rather than leave this guy out on the street getting wet and getting sick, if they'd housed him, they would have saved all that money. Now, I'm not saying that we need to take these people off the street and spend $350,000 on them, but that's what we're doing when they get sick.
I think I have read quite a few of Malcolm Gladwell's books. I think I might have read that story, or I might have read something really, really similar. It might have been in Las Vegas, though.
Maybe it was Las Vegas.
I think it might have, then it's the same one.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's just crazy to, and a lot of people, what I've read, to what I understand about it is it's chronic homelessness. It's like the 80-20 rule. It's like the 80% of the homeless, they are the ones who are causing the largest impact on, like, our healthcare system, like our mental health system. So if we took care of that chronic 80%, it would be a huge relief in terms of the financial cost of it.
Yeah. So
and like you said, I think, like, a really cool thing that they pointed out in his book, or it might have been another study that I was reading. Basically, if you were to assign someone to effectively, like, supervise and care for someone who's homeless, and kind of give them, like, almost like a motherly figure, someone just, like, generally looking out for them and a place to live, it drastically helps their situation.
It does.
It's just, like, having someone look after them, having someone check in on them. It's not even so much as, like, a lot of the other things we talk about. It's not like giving them money. It's like, that's not going to fix it. No. Basically, if you give them somewhat of a purpose.
It all starts with housing. If you've got a good house, a good safe place to live, then a lot of things get better for you. You can get your confidence up. You can get a job. You can you can get back in the game. So So anyway, like I said before, what we're supposed to do is tax rich people to provide for people who are of less advantage, and hoping that somehow the developers are going to do it.
But the rich people are clever enough to figure out how to not pay tax. Often it's like the middle class that are paying the highest taxes.
We could have another whole thing on that. Yeah.
Which I'd like to at some point. That's a great conversation.
What we should do is we should have a session on real estate accounting and real estate taxation.
Yeah.
Please. That'd be awesome.
What do you think, Manny?
Yeah, that's great. No, this has been a great conversation.
This is good fun talking to you.
Yeah. I think we're running right in on time.
We'll probably be a two-parter.
This might be a two-parter.
Good.
And then there might be a part 3 about real estate taxes.
No, it's great. It's great meeting you too, and yeah, you guys are building Halifax for the future, which is what we need.
Absolutely. We're trying our best.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. Like, I've known Andrew for almost a year now, and yeah, you've done some great things in Halifax, and you've got some great stories to share, and yeah, tons of information to share, and that's what we're here today, just to share with our listeners some of the things that, I don't know, we want people to know and help understand, and maybe educate yourselves on real estate in Halifax. And
Yeah.
Anybody that listens to our podcast, all 5 people, if they want to reach out to you, is there a means?
They can find me on the internet quick enough.
Yeah, okay, just Google Andrew Murphy, find you.
Yeah.
Andrew the accountant.
Okay, perfect. Cool. All right.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.